Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into a really specific worldview, one that's, deeply skeptical of the official story. So what we've done is pull together a range of critical articles from this month to piece together how this perspective sees the world, from global power all the way down to the food on your shelf. When you really look at all these different sources, they're all kind of circling the same central question, whether they say it out loud or not. What does the world actually look like when you start from a place of just deep skepticism toward the powers that be? So to get our heads around this, we're going to break it down into 5 main themes that just kept popping up. We'll look at the gap between a political vision and what really happens, the shaky ground of the U.S. economy, some really controversial foreign alliances, a perceived war on information, and finally, this call for a brand new multipolar world. All right, let's dive right in. So first up, we're looking at this gap these sources are pointing out, the space between the political promises and the actual policies, focusing on critiques of the current administration's actions versus its words. Okay, so here's the real clash these articles get into, the image versus the action. On one side, you've got the big slogan and the image of a peacemaker who's ending wars. But the critics, like Karen Kuyatsky, they see something totally different. They see the same old story of DC imperialism, just with a different coat of paint. And look, to back this up, they're not just talking about words, right? They're pointing to a specific timeline of actions. Philip Giraldi lays it out in an article, arguing that moves like ditching the Iran deal, the Soleimani assassination, and more recent military actions, well, they just don't line up with any man of peace story. And this is where it gets really interesting. Karen Kiankatsky uses this incredible metaphor to try and explain what she sees going on. She compares the whole political style to a Texas wasp moth. It's an insect that looks super dangerous, like it'll sting you, but it's just a bluff to keep predators away. The argument is that the tough talk is just camouflage, not the real thing. Okay, so that same skepticism, it carries right over into the economy. This next big theme we're going to hit is all about the administration's fiscal policies. And let's just say these commentators are alarmed, to put it mildly. And their whole argument really kicks off with this one just massive number. Sources like the Burning Platform are pointing to a projected debt increase of almost $2 trillion in 1 year. They're basically screaming that this is completely and totally unsustainable. Okay, but wait, what about the good news, right? The administration is celebrating one really big number, a huge jump in money coming from tariffs. It's more than doubled in just 6 months, and on paper, that looks like a major win. Yeah, but hold on, writers like Jim Quinn jump on that immediately and pretty much tear that argument apart. His point is, when the government is adding $5.5 billion to the debt every single day, that extra tariff money, it's gone in less than 2 months. It's like trying to fill the ocean with a teaspoon. And this leads to something they talk about a lot, this kind of hidden tax they call shrinkflation. One article gives this perfect example. You go to buy paper plates, and the pack that used to have 70 now has 50. But it costs the same. You're getting less for your money, which is basically a 40% price hike that official inflation numbers totally miss. All right, so that idea of American interests versus what the government is actually doing, well, it gets even sharper in this next section. We found multiple sources focusing with just incredible intensity on one specific foreign alliance, the U.S. relationship with Israel. So before we dive into the really controversial stuff, we gotta quickly get on the same page about what the BDS movement is. It stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. It's an international campaign trying to put economic pressure on Israel. And this movement is at the very center of a new rule these sources are talking about. And to show just how deep this commitment goes, the sources point right to official statements. Philip Giraldi cites this quote from a White House letter, and it's held up as the core of the whole policy. America stands firmly with Israel. And here's where it gets wild. This is the part that really stands out. Giraldi reports on a new rule that would actually tie American disaster relief, we're talking FEMA funds for our own cities after a hurricane or a flood, to a policy about a foreign country. The rule would literally block that money if a city boycotts Israeli companies. And this proposed policy is what leads Philip Giraldi to ask this. Well, it's a bombshell of a question. He basically reframes the whole thing, saying it's not just about policy anymore. He asks if this is a betrayal of American interests, and he even uses the word treason to show just how serious he thinks it is. So, if you're already skeptical of government policy, it kind of makes sense that you'd also start questioning the information you're getting, right? That's the logical next step, and these articles argue that there's a full-blown information war being fought over what we believe about, well, everything. Let's start with diet. The critique kicks off with a pretty shocking statistic. Almost 2/3 of the calories our kids are eating come from ultra-processed foods. But the real war, according to these sources, isn't just about the food itself. It's about how we're all supposed to feel about this fact. And check this out. This is a perfect example of that information war in action. The blog Coffee and COVID contrasts two stories. The mainstream one, from the New York Times, is basically, hey, calm down, the science is flawed. But the contrarian view is the total opposite. No, this stuff is factory-made junk that causes disease. They're two stories that just can't both be true. And they see the same thing happening with crime reporting. One source puts two headlines side by side. You've got a national paper saying DC crime rates are dropping, and then a local news report where the DC police union itself is accusing the department of faking the numbers to make them look lower. So, the question is, who do you believe? Okay, so let's put it all together. You're skeptical of your country's policies, you're skeptical of the economy, you don't trust the news. What's the end game? Well, for these sources, it all points toward a totally new global order, one that moves away from American leadership to a multipolar world. Now, to really get what they're proposing, you have to understand a couple of key terms they use. Economist Michael Hudson talks about financial colonialism, basically controlling countries with debt instead of armies, and odious debt. That's debt forced on a country that doesn't actually help its people, which he argues shouldn't even count. They see these as the main weapons of the current system. So the argument for this whole new system basically boils down to a few big points. First, they critique the current setup, saying institutions like the IMF are just tools for U.S. policy. Second, they point to a real shift in power. China controlling crucial resources, and the BRICS Plus alliance now representing over half the world's population. So their conclusion is that a new system with new institutions isn't just a good idea, it's inevitable. And that's where all of this leaves us. After digging through all these critiques of policy, the economy, and information itself, we land on this really tough, fundamental question. In an age where we are just bombarded with information, when we're faced with these huge, all-encompassing worldviews, how do we figure out what's what? How do we tell the difference between credible dissent and a dangerous delusion? That, right there, is the puzzle at the heart of everything today.